Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be in Moscow, and I thank ECAD and our Swedish delegation for organizing this kind invitation. Moscow is a legendary city. It is blessed with geography and climate that formed a natural barrier to foreign invaders for centuries. We arrive in Moscow to share our common concerns of another formidable invader, drugs. Drugs can invade, cross all national boundaries, and threaten our future. The invasion can be as harmful as the Tatars were to Moscow, and they can be surmounted as definitively as Ivan the Great expelled the Tatars from the Rus. Over millennia, our ancestors were foraging for food, and they discovered plants that serendipitously had certain medicinal and psychoactive properties. We know that some of these plants, such as marijuana and opioids, were used for thousands of years. In an archaeological site in Israel 1,400 years ago, this site was uncovered showing a pregnant 14-year-old girl who died in the course of childbirth. And when she died, the fetus was embedded in her pelvis, and it was obvious that she was unable to give birth because she was too small in order to deliver a full-term baby. And next to her nose were ashes that were found. And these ashes were analyzed, and it was discovered that in these ashes there was delta-6 tetrahydrocannabinol, is a metabolite of cannabis that will survive over centuries. And it is believed that these ashes were used in order, this cannabis was used in order to try to promote uterine contractions, in order to try to accelerate and help this unfortunate girl during the throes of childbirth. Many modern medicines have arrived from plants. In the 19th century, science moved us from chewing bark, from eating flowers, to pure substances, including digitalis, atropine, aspirin, and quinine used for tuberculosis. Most of these plants contain drugs that could be fatal if they were ingested at high enough amounts. And our ancestors found not only medicinal properties, but pleasure in plants such as cocaine and heroin, in marijuana and methamphetamine. The reason that these plants produce these drugs, in most cases, is because they're insecticides. They act on the nervous system in the same way that they act on our nervous system, but they act in insects. And over the years, especially in the 19th century, the active ingredients of these plants were isolated, and they were created in purified form, which when ingested by humans can give rise to pleasure as well as tremendous medical and psychological and behavioral consequences, including death. So we now face an unprecedented level of use, and we also face an unprecedented level of biological, behavioral, and medical consequences. I have spent most of my life investigating the science of drugs, both therapeutic as well as addictive. And as a scientist, I never imagined myself being involved in policy or politics. But one day a phone call came from the White House. And the question was, I am a lawyer and I am acting on behalf of the president, and if you are willing to serve, can the president nominate you to be the demand reduction drug czar, so to speak, of the United States? There was a very, very labor-intensive nomination process that had me feel as if I'm a victim of a sumo wrestler during the procedure. I have an entire bookcase filled of the documents that were required for security clearance and for other issues. And so my career path changed dramatically in the course of a few months, from one of a scientist to one of a policymaker. And it all begins with a cake of congratulations, a swearing-in ceremony, and it ends with a cake. But in between there is nothing sweet or cake-like with it, because the portfolio of a person in charge of demand reduction for the United States and for international policy has so many weighty problems on their heads, including human consequences, the costs, what to do about other nations and their policies, specific population, emerging threats like designer drugs, how to address the unidentified, the untreated, what treatments to advance, what research voids are there in science, how can we scale the problem? If we have solutions, how can we take a solution that's scientifically based and build on it and capture as many population cohorts as possible, and also how to deal with controversies. So on the political front, my reliance on objective data is the key to persuasion we're constantly challenged. Science is the most powerful engine in garnering support from politicians and biomedical community. When I went to the Senate and to the House, I always carried scientific manuscripts with me to convince people of the validity of our approach and why to invest money in it. But bundling scientific evidence with analysis of resistance to novel ideas, our appeals to values and to ethics and to conscience and to empathy with the plight of others was the most effective strategy in terms of garnering political support for what I did. Is that regardless if it's adaptation or toxicity, the brain is no longer normal. It is no longer the way it was when we began. And then a person begins to abuse. They begin to use more and more with unintended consequences, which leads to addiction. If the person decides to be abstinent, they undergo withdrawal. Every single drug that affects the brain this way incurs a withdrawal symptom, whether it's physical or psychological. And then a person will go into treatment, and after a treatment session is over, they may undergo craving. Craving is intense within months of finishing treatment. There's a vulnerable period in the first year, but that craving can hit almost any time in a person's lifetime, and then they can relapse. How do we view addiction in terms of human qualities? We can view it certainly in terms of biology, but it's a shift in values. Our first and primary value is survival, safety, stability, belonging, esteem, character. Aesthetic values, recreation, and hedonism, just the pursuit of pure pleasure at the expense of all these, is not very high on our value system. But when drugs begin to commandeer the brain, hedonism, the pursuit of that pure pleasure, becomes primary, and recreation and all the others begin to wane. So, what is addiction as a brain disease? First, it's a loss of control. Compulsive drug seeking, compulsive use, inability to control how much, and use more than you intended to use. And you use despite adverse consequences, health, social, educational. You use instead of engaging in important life activities, and you spend emotional, physical time in use. Then you also can have physical symptoms, tolerance and withdrawal. But that's not true only of drugs of abuse or addiction. You can have tolerance and withdrawal to therapeutic drugs as well. Addiction falls along a spectrum from the less severe to the most severe. What are some of the current theories on the biology of addiction? None of them is correct or accurate. There are many questions, but let's look at natural rewards, treatments that improve your inhibitory control, treatments that strengthen the links between these two brain areas, treatments that interfere with conditioned memories, the memories of the drug experience, treatments that promote new learning, treatments that counteract stress that leads to relapse. I won't get into all of these, but all of these are based on the biology of addiction. I don't believe in explaining things unless you have a solution to problems. All human problems are man-made, and all these problems have solutions that can be addressed. And my philosophy has always been, let's find solutions instead of saying, this is a disaster. Do drug consequences justify legal control? The medical, the economic, there's the ruble and the euro, the safety and social and addiction consequences are very high. I'm just going to give you very quickly some of the consequences that we're aware of. We are seeing more and more drug driving fatalities, deaths due to drug driving. Marijuana is the most common drug found in these. We are seeing that drugs affect the workplace significantly. Users are 2 to 5 times more likely to have a lot of jobs, unexcused absences, been fired, early dismissal, time off, being late for work, and workplace accidents, file a workers' compensation, and they're 1/3 less productive. Drugs produce medical diseases in the brain, in the lungs, the heart, blood vessels, hormones, liver, digestive, reproduction. Strokes in young people. The most common reason for strokes in young people are cocaine, amphetamine, and methamphetamine in that order. And what we can see in terms of medical consequences, people with substance abuse or addiction, much more likely to have depression, injuries and overdoses, anxiety disorders, lower back pain, headaches, hypertension. The list is 3 times longer than this. I won't get into it. And we never had this study until this past year. Steve Kish, a friend of mine in the University of Toronto, mined some data from California. They examined the death rates of people who are addicted to cocaine, alcohol, marijuana, amphetamine, and opioids. The death rates for alcohol, for marijuana, for methamphetamine, and opioids were much, much higher than people without a substance use disorder. Is that what we want in our future? So should brain disease model affect drug policy? We have to weigh public safety with public health, and we always weigh things. Science says that drugs induce brain behavioral changes, a disease state. Science says that users, addicts' consequences can be severe for themselves and for others, including children, including family members. Even the medical conditions of family members are higher. Science says that imprisoned addicts without treatment have a very limited chance of staying out of prison. Science says that all diseases should be treated. Why treat this any differently than any other? And treatment is effective. That's what science says. Some people say users and addicts want to be left alone. They don't think they have a problem. I've heard this said very frequently. We have free choice. Why should a government tell us what to do? If some people age out of addiction, let nature prevail. And I say no to all three, because none of these are without consequences to other people, to our taxation rate, to our legal system, to the health and safety of others in the workplace, on the roads. We know that drug courts can work. Coercive treatment is effective. This is basically a beautiful